Okay, well, can you all hear me okay? Beautiful. Okay, I apologize. My goodness, rural America broadband is not treating me well. I moved to my vehicle with hopefully a stronger connection. So I hope that this works out well here. And it looks like some of the font might be a little off too. So if there's pieces on the screen that is cut off in later parts, I'll email this to the group if you're interested in it, and then we can continue the conversation. But I do want to just, I appreciate being able to get to go after the first two presentations for this, because I think that they set us up well for being able to talk about how we talk about food insecurity in certain areas of conflict. And knowing that food insecurity is such a huge conversation, a lot of different dynamics that are around that particular topic. Thinking about ways that we can connect with individuals who see it on the front end and some of the worst areas of food insecurity, that allows us to think about how we can enable our military leaders. So I'm excited to share a couple of ideas on how we can support them moving forward. So Sarah, I think you can go ahead and move it on if you're ready. So the first is just to set some context in food insecurity. And I know that our participants here have probably years and years of experience working with food insecurity in an international setting. Um, but one thing that we know about food insecurity is it's directly linked to a lot of our stability efforts across the world, especially in economic, political, and social stability standpoints. And so if we're looking and thinking about how do we conceptualize food insecurity and its relationship with programming, we need to understand that there's a direct relationship to those three things with how much food and access that people have within an international setting. And just 2 years ago, 1 out of every 9 people in the world were undernourished. And that's not just a, hey, I've got a rumbling in my stomach. That's a severe where different decisions are being made and impact is being made because people don't have access to food. And so if we're looking at the total number of participants on this call, that would mean we would have about 2.25 of our people would not know where their next meal comes from. And in our areas of immediate concern, we start to think about food insecurity across the world. That goes into our areas of conflict. And Sarah, if you move that next slide over, you'll see that our world hunger map here just last year, the different colors are rated on the levels of severity and food insecurity. So if we're thinking about immediate areas of conflict being the most food insecure parts of the world, you can see that illustrated in the geographic standpoint. And a lot of these same areas are experiencing either current, post, or emerging levels of conflict, which means that as we think about food insecurity, we've got to involve a few other audiences into the population. So the next slide talks about how do we define and how do we conceptualize food insecurity. And so Sarah, go ahead, thank you. FAO describes food insecurity with 4 key dimensions. And just to set some context here, so we were talking about the same thing, food insecurity is defined by availability of food, access to a stable food supply, utilization of our nutrients over time, and how stable does that continue over a sustainability piece. And so if we're rethinking back to the map that we just saw, the colors of the different countries that are on there are experiencing various challenges related to their food insecurity. So it could be their availability, access, maybe they don't have the appropriate level of nutrients needed, or there's not a stable, secure system to maintain that over time. So if we could move into the next slide, which brings us to where we're talking about with people in agriculture and extension education. In the current state, in several parts of the Middle East in particular, Afghanistan, Northern Africa, we see that we're in the middle of a conflict crisis, where in certain situations, if we're experiencing extreme levels of food insecurity, we see that conflict can drive hunger, and hunger can also drive conflict. And so the more that we can investigate that relationship, the better we'll enable the people that work in there on the day-to-day with boots on the ground. So the next slide shows a brief statement on a hearing to the Terrorism and Unconventional Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee. This is kind of in the heat of the global war on terror in Afghanistan. But this came from one of our majors that were in the United States Army that was reporting to this committee to Congress, and saying that one of the real gaps that we're missing is an agency specifically focusing on nation building, falls to the military, but they're not trained in it. And then if we scroll down, kind of view our slide, and these skills do exist in places like the Department of Agriculture, State and Treasury, and then the civilian sector, various other places, but there's no organization that knits them together in peacetime, so we're ready when a war breaks out. And we think this is one of the big organizational gaps that we have to fill, which helps me I'm really excited to present that I think that we have a really unique opportunity. Go ahead, Sarah. A really unique opportunity within agriculture and education to enable those people that are seeing conflict, AKA food insecurity at the highest levels on the ground. The next slide is through various levels of agricultural assessment. And I know that we've got Nick here on the call, and I'm going to love to hear his perspective as we're moving forward too. But this is based on some doctoral work that I did at Texas A&M. And if we're thinking about what agricultural assessment looks like in areas of conflict, there's 4 kind of key phases or groups. And we know that this isn't a linear pattern, right? And it's not this clean, it's not this simple. But if we're conceptualizing it and we're thinking about how do we talk about agriculture assessment in areas of conflict, these are kind of the key subgroups that are involved. So our U.S. intelligence community, phase 2, U.S. Army Special Forces. We have a representative from Civil Affairs. Thank you for your service, Nick. They're in phase 3. And then we start to move into some of our longer term development lens with our whole of government sector. So USAID, non-government organizations, public and private partners. A lot of the work with the framework that we're about to show here in a second, based on my doctoral work, was in that phase 2. So we worked with the U.S. Army Special Forces to help us understand agriculture and assessment criterion in areas of conflict. So this tool that you see here on this slide is called A-Scope PMISI, real fancy title, but we appreciate how practical it is. You'll see that there's operational considerations along the top columns. So the PMESII, PMISI, those are called operational considerations in area of conflict. The ones rolling down on the side for the different rows are civil considerations, and that spells out A-Scope PMISI. So a tool that we have for being able to advance research in this category kind of appears as on the next slide, and as a finding that we had within that study. And based on a few interviews, and we can expand that in a different conversation, but a few interviews with some of our Special Forces soldiers that talk about how agriculture is key to their mission in certain areas of conflict, we see that food insecurity overlays across their assessment tool, and that's what we've illustrated here. So we've added another dimension going across that intersects our civil considerations and our operational considerations, because we know that food insecurity and food security have a direct tie to political, military, economic, social, information, and infrastructure considerations. And one of the areas, and maybe a call for action and a opportunity to collaborate for those who are interested, is advancing research from people who study agriculture and extension settings based on these 6 different dimensions in areas of conflict, because we know that food insecurity in these zones is different than just talking about how do we gain enough food in different households. There's multiple different layers to that. And so I'll share one brief example here. So if we're looking at food insecurity as it relates to an intersection with political settings, you'll see that some of the assessment priorities when looking at certain areas of conflict is who's owning the land, what is the destination of food surpluses, a little bit of an involvement with the supply chain, who and where did the taxes go for different food products, and safety inspections. So if we're thinking about how do we research, how do we add the body of knowledge to individuals that would use this material, this could be one way that we could support our military leaders in areas of conflict. And then Sarah, if you can go ahead and move on. I'm happy to expand and have a further conversation on those other priority areas, but in the sake of time, we'll keep moving forward. And here's some tangible ways that partners and everybody on this call, if you'd be interested in collaborating, steps for how we can move forward and how our body of people in agriculture and extension education in international settings can support our US Department of Defense. So one opportunity in previous conversations with working with our military leaders is being able to get information to those people with region-specific assessment needs regarding food insecurity variables. The group that we worked with were the 5th Group Special Forces. So their area of responsibility was the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Northern Africa. And so some of their conversation was saying, we know that there's key partners in multiple areas within our area of responsibility, but that information is not communicated to some of those individuals that are on the ground. So streamlining that process with people who are researching this, working in areas of development, to getting it to helping them within some of the defense level priority areas. Being able to connect with partners who conduct agriculture assessments in conflict zones. So on that previous slide, if we were talking about the 4 phases of ag assessment in areas of conflict, we know that we have the US intelligence community, our US Army Special Forces, civil affairs and psychological operations, and then our whole of government as we bring in USAID, NGOs, public and private partners. And so being able to create a streamlined effort of information to connect those different partners with one mission to help people alleviate some food insecurity issues. And then another area that was a high recommendation and need that they identified with us is being able to expand our research and our scholarship in national security and conflict related journals to help them understand what's going on with AIAEE or related affiliates. So if we can move to the next slide here, just to wrap up and in conclusion, I believe that if we want to impact food insecurity in the highest areas that need it the most, we need to find ways that we can touch and influence, work with, collaborate with organizations and groups who are seeing it on the day-to-day with boots on the ground. And happy to go ahead and move to the next slide. And I'm happy to help with collaborating through that. I do want to just pause really quick. Nick, thank you for your service. I have an interview with the US Army Civil Affairs group next week about possibly enlisting myself. So I appreciate your service to this great country. And if we have time, be happy to answer any questions.
Do it. Best decision I ever made.
Love it. So Dr. Bush, if we have time for questions, I'd be happy to answer one, or my email's listed on that slide. And again, thank you all for letting me be adaptable.
You also have 2 minutes, and then we can open up the floor just for wide discussion. So if anyone has any thoughts or comments for Shannon, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question. Hi, Shannon. Thank you very much for your presentation. When in Afghanistan, there were PRT teams set up within the military bases, which stand for Provincial Reconstruction Teams, where USAID will bring in experts to work with military and support them in that effort that you were exploring. Did you look into those in your research? And
yes, absolutely. Thank you for your question. So the Provisional Reconstruction Teams were a key initiative during the primary area war in Afghanistan. And so I also want to thank Carmen for her service, because I believe that she did some work with them in the US Army as well. That particular initiative was working on nation building and stability efforts with bringing in experts that were economic minded, agriculture development, to try to gauge and help communities within those areas of conflict regain their infrastructure. Those teams have not been refunded as of recent. And so trying to think about how do we continue the work that they've done, the scholarship that they've done with a streamlined effort is where this step kind of came in. But absolutely, the PRC teams have been, PRT teams have been extremely valuable in understanding what relationships have happened in areas of conflict.